What if freedom wasn't a rescue, but a choice whispered through the dust of a dying world? The prairie stretched out before her like a graveyard of forgotten dreams, flat, endless, and littered with the remnants of other people's losses. Kasha Wren stood at the edge of it, her fingers raw and reddened from hours spent scrubbing the black crust of oil from the fine-tiled floors of Cornelius Vane's estate. Her knuckles ached, her palms burned, but it was the silence within her that hurt most. In her trembling hand, she clutched a small silver locket, its hinge worn from years of being opened and closed, as if repetition could call back the dead. Inside, Caleb Rune's portrait had faded to a ghost, his smile barely visible now, a smear of sepia clinging to memory. 5 years had passed since the raiders came. 5 years since they burned through her world with the cruelty of men who wanted nothing but to erase, and succeeded. In the aftermath, she'd wandered through towns and judgments until Vane found her. Or rather, claimed her. Cornelius Vane, with his polished boots and honeyed voice, was no rescuer. He was a man who trafficked in appearances, cloaking ownership in the language of benevolence. When he took Kasha in, he dressed it up as mercy, wrapping it in phrases like fortune and providence. But it was never about her safety. It was about control. He saw her not as a person, but as a project, a possession to be shaped and displayed, a mark of his own magnanimity. The roof over her head, the food on her plate, even the silks he had tailored to drape over her shoulders were not gifts. They were barbs. Every act of supposed kindness was a thread in the invisible snare he crafted, and the tighter she tried to breathe, the more entangled she became. Her gratitude was not only expected, but demanded, woven into every word he spoke, every sideways glance from the staff who knew better than to treat her as one of their own. By day, she walked the halls of his estate like a phantom, seen, adorned, paraded when needed, but never truly acknowledged. And by night, beneath the thick quilts he insisted were necessary against the cold. Even when the room stifled with heat, she lay awake, eyes wide, heart taut, listening to the ceaseless gnashing of drills tearing into the land. That sound never stopped. It reverberated through the floorboards, through her bones, a brutal reminder of the machine Vane had built, not just to extract oil, but to extract the will from everything around him. She would close her eyes and escape in silence, turning herself into something other than woman, other than captive. She became a hawk in her imaginings, wings spread wide, gliding over the distant ridges, far from the groaning steel, above the poisoned ground. In those quiet flights of thought, she remembered what it was to be untethered, not saved, not held, free. Those were not dreams of escape, but acts of resistance, a way to keep alive the part of her that had once moved through the world on her own terms. And then Joran Vale arrived. He did not announce himself. He did not seek to claim or correct or cure. His silence said more than any speech Vane ever gave, and his gaze, steady, unflinching, met hers not with question, not with pity, but with knowledge. He didn't study her. He didn't try to decipher the shape of her pain. He simply recognized it. That recognition was not loud, not transformative in an instant. It didn't ignite hope. Hope, at that time, was still too fragile, too near the edge of ruin to be trusted. But something happened in that quiet moment. Something subtle, but irreversible. The ice that had formed thick and silent around her will thinned, cracked. In his eyes, she saw not herself as Vane wanted her to be, refined, obedient, broken, but the woman she had once been before all of it. Before Caleb Rune died, before her child was taken from her arms, before she became a ghost in someone else's house. That woman, the one who had loved without shame, fought without hesitation, and stood her ground even as the world tried to pull it out from under her, was still there, dormant, buried, but not destroyed. And now, stirred by something as quiet as being seen, she shifted beneath the surface. Not yet alive, but no longer asleep. Joran Vale's presence at Vane's estate was not loud or ostentatious, but it lingered like smoke, unseen yet pervasive, slipping through cracks and settling into corners where it wasn't invited but could not be ignored. He didn't carry the arrogance of ownership or the bluster of men used to being obeyed. Instead, he moved with a quiet gravity, a kind of knowing that unnerved those who thrived on spectacle, like Cornelius Vane. Joran Vale's silence wasn't empty. It had weight, and it pressed on Vane in ways he couldn't name. Where other men filled silence with noise and declarations, Joran Vale let stillness speak, and somehow it spoke louder. It unsettled Vane precisely because it couldn't be bought or manipulated. Joran Vale wasn't here to prove himself. He was here to witness, and that, in a place built on dominance and transaction, made him dangerous. Cassia felt it, too. Not just his presence, but his refusal to perform power. He stood apart from the men who carved wealth from the land as if they had a right to its blood. Joran Vale didn't carve. He listened. Often, she'd see him pause mid-step, his head tilted slightly, eyes half closed, as if he were listening to something beneath the wind. The rustle of grass, the breath of earth, the unspoken stories the soil tried to tell. He was not a man who conquered. He was a man who coexisted. And to those obsessed with taking, that kind of presence was an act of defiance. She watched him from the shadows, as she always did, because the edges were where she had learned to survive. There, she could be useful, quiet, invisible. But somehow he saw her, not in the way men had always seen her, as something to possess or pity, but truly saw her as one recognizes another whose absence speaks louder than their presence. And that recognition chipped at something she had buried deep. It was just after dawn one morning, the air still cool and tinted with pale gold, when she found him at the well. She had risen early, as always, to fetch water. Repetition was safety, routine her armor. She expected solitude, but he was there already, standing with his back straight, his silhouette clean against the soft mist. He didn't speak at first, just nodded, acknowledging her without intrusion. Then, quietly, he asked, "Do you like it here?" The question startled her, not because it was strange, but because it was the first time anyone had asked her something that wasn't about what she could do, but how she felt. It sliced through her like a whisper-shaped blade. No one had asked her that since Caleb ruined, and even then, the question hadn't held this kind of weight. It had never been asked as though her answer mattered. She felt something twist in her chest as the words rose before she could stop them. "I feel buried most days," she said, almost to the wind, almost to herself. And when she said it, something loosened in her, like soil shifting around a long-forgotten root. Joran Vale didn't comfort her. He didn't soften or retreat. He met her honesty with his own, unflinching and steady. "You're not buried," he said. "Not if you can still reach toward the sun." His voice was quiet, but the words lodged deep, not like kindness, but like a dare. And she carried them in her like a match waiting for the right strike. Days passed. The estate continued its grind. Men with plans, women with scars, and Cassia, ever obedient, ever unseen. Until one evening, Vane spoke with a smile that meant danger. He was in one of his grand moods, puffed up by power, when he let it slip. He intended to sell Cassia's contract to an investor in Chicago. He framed it like an opportunity, a promotion wrapped in silk. But the silk was threadbare, and she could see the iron beneath. He didn't mean to elevate her. He meant to trade her again, like acreage, like livestock, like a thing. The room blurred. Her limbs chilled. It was too familiar, too cruel. She had been taken once, in blood, fire, and screaming. She would not be taken again with a signature. That night, when her body still trembled and she struggled to keep breath in her lungs, she returned to her quarters, expecting nothing. But there it was on the sill, a carved feather. This one darker, rougher, hewn from cedar. The edges weren't smooth, but alive with texture, imperfect but real. She didn't need to wonder who had placed it there. She knew, and she knew what it meant. Not a gift, not a token, a message. You are seen. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. She held it in her hands as if it were warm, and for a moment, she felt something stir. Something slow and stubborn and old. Not rage, not grief, not even hope, just movement. Something inside her had shifted, not just in response to what loomed, but toward something else entirely. Toward choice. Cash's defiance didn't arrive in thunder. It sparked like flint against stone, small, sharp, and enough to burn. It began when the Chicago investor came to inspect what he believed was already his. She greeted him with measured politeness, but there was ice in her voice, a stillness in her eyes that warned of hidden blades. When his gaze lingered too long, too openly, she didn't shrink. She held it, daring him. A silent war waged across the tea service she laid before him. Her every motion precise, deliberate. She wasn't serving him, she was warning him. Later that night, wrapped in the hush of shadows and the cold breath of the prairie, Cassia crept through the narrow alleys behind the estate and crouched near the worn edge of the servant quarters. Her breath came in shallow bursts, not from fear, but urgency. There, in the half-light, she found Fenlark, the stable boy with perpetually muddy hands, youngster with a face smudged with soot and eyes that hadn't yet learned to look away from suffering. Once, when her fingers were too numb from hunger to lift a spoon, he had left her biscuits under a bent floorboard. He had never asked for thanks. Now, she was asking for something more. She reached into the folds of her apron and pulled out a tiny charm, carved from wood, worn smooth from years of being held. A horse, small and rough-hewn, but still strong-legged and wild-eyed. A relic from before Vane, before the drills, before her voice had thinned to a whisper. She placed it into Fenlark's palm and closed his fingers around it with quiet insistence. "Find Joran Vale," she said, her voice rasping against her own throat. "Tell him I'm still here, but I'm not his." Her eyes searched the boy's face, not for understanding, but for faith. He nodded once, a motion too serious for someone so young, then turned and slipped into the darkness like a promise carried by the wind. Dawn didn't rise, it tore. The horizon split open, spilling a sun that burned red as a fresh wound, casting long, blood-tinged shadows across the estate. The air trembled with the approach of hooves, deep, rhythmic, and unhurried, like the pulse of something ancient and inevitable. Joran Vale came not with spectacle, not cloaked in the noise and violence men like Vane respected, but with a quiet gravity that made the earth seem to still around him. He rode flanked by 3 others, each one silent, faces unreadable, posture calm. No blades at their sides, no rifles across their backs, only the kind of steadiness that made weapons unnecessary. They didn't come to threaten, they came to end something. Joran Vale was the first to dismount. His boots struck the estate's immaculate gravel with the finality of a gavel. There was no hesitation in his stride, no need for permission. His presence was a declaration. When he reached Vane, he let a worn satchel fall to the ground with a dull, unceremonious thud. It didn't need embellishment. Within it, pelts silver labor survival, currency of a kind Vane could never understand, offered not in supplication but closure. "She's not your possession," Joran Vale said, voice low and even. Yet the words carried, slicing through the humid morning like a blade honed on silence. They echoed in the spaces between breath and heartbeat, undeniable. The estate itself seemed to still. Time hung, suspended, the air tight with anticipation. Servants froze, caught mid-step, their tasks forgotten, their eyes flicking between the 2 men and the woman standing behind them, as if realizing they'd become witnesses to something unrepeatable. Even the birds fell silent. A hush like that doesn't happen unless the world itself is listening. Vane's jaw twitched, his mouth twisted into the beginnings of a snarl, disbelief warring with outrage. But before his voice could rise to fill the void, Kasha moved. Her body was not steady. Her knees threatened to buckle, her fingers curled too tightly, but her steps were sure. She walked forward like someone who had already grieved the version of herself that once begged to stay quiet. Her voice, when it came, was neither loud nor bold. It trembled, but it carried. I want to leave. Nothing more. No explanations. Just the clean cut of truth, spoken aloud at last. The blow landed harder than a scream would have. Vane's mask shattered, fury bleeding into his expression as he hissed, "Walk out, and you don't come back." But she didn't stop to consider. She didn't flinch. Her face didn't twist into resistance or sorrow. She simply walked, past the investor who had appraised her like property, past the servants who had stood by in silence, complicity etched into every averted gaze, past the chandeliers and velvet and polished staircases meant to make her forget where she came from. The house hadn't changed, but she had. The door, once an impassable barrier, now opened like a wound she no longer feared. Outside, the sky had softened, the storm sun giving way to a breeze thick with the scent of sage, dust, and the first promise of rain. Joran Vale stood beneath it, as rooted as the stones at his feet. He didn't reach for her, didn't try to pull her into his shadow. He didn't need to. What he offered wasn't escape, it was space. And she crossed into it on her own terms, her own breath steadying in her chest. There was no triumph in her eyes, no elation, only something quieter, deeper. The stillness that comes after a long-held note has finally ended. She didn't walk to him because he saved her. She walked to him because she didn't need saving anymore. Freedom felt foreign beneath her boots, too soft and unsteady after years of walking on eggshells. As they rode beneath a pale, silver-streaked sky, Kasha struggled to quiet the storm inside her, even as the world around her seemed finally at peace. The village came into view gradually, glowing warm and alive in the cradle of the land. There was no urgency in the air, no barked orders or eyes that measured worth. Children ran barefoot through the dust, their laughter pure and untethered. Elders sat weaving corn into braids, their hands slow, deliberate, unburdened by haste. Life unfolded here without fear. Kasha dismounted stiffly, the motion unfamiliar now without permission. Her heart beat a cautious rhythm, unsure of what came next. She half expected stares or whispered judgments. But Joran Vale stood beside her, grounding her with the same quiet certainty he always carried. He didn't explain her past or offer apologies on her behalf. He simply said, "This is Kasha. She will stay." No one questioned him. No one asked why. Instead, an elder woman stepped forward and handed Kasha a cup of water, clear, cold, and offered without condition. Another draped a woven cloth over her shoulders, the weight of it warm, almost ceremonial. It wasn't grand. It wasn't loud. But in its stillness, it felt like acceptance. Later, beneath the layered hush of night and the soft crackle of firelight, Joran Vale sat across from her, legs folded, shoulders loose, as if the world around him had already gone quiet. His hands moved with patient precision, whittling a sliver of bone with slow, deliberate strokes. The scrape of blade against bone was rhythmic, almost meditative, the kind of sound that slipped past the ears and into the body. It steadied her in ways she didn't understand. Watching him work, wordless, grounded, lulled something frayed and restless inside her, as though the scattered pieces of her grief recognized the quiet and began to settle. When he finished, he reached across the space between them and placed a carving in her open palm. It was a small bear, round, weighty, and solid in its simplicity. No flourish, no ceremony. He didn't offer explanation, didn't name its meaning. He didn't need to. The bear said what he didn't. Strength without spectacle. Survival without apology. She stared at it, turning it over gently, her fingers brushing the smooth edges like she might wake it, or herself from a dream. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the tenderness of receiving something meant only for her. Her throat tightened as if the shape of the bear had carved loose something inside her. The silence between them stretched, deep and warm, until she broke it with a whisper, so quiet it felt like it belonged more to the fire than to the air. I forgot how to hum. The words came not as a confession, but as a release, truth uncaged after years of swallowing sound. It wasn't just about music. It was about memory, about voice, about the pieces of herself she'd silenced to survive. Joran Vale didn't lift his gaze. He didn't speak with sympathy or surprise. His response came calm and steady, a kind of invitation. Hum again. So she did. Not perfectly, not proudly, just honestly. A single note, soft and unsure, slipped past her lips like the first light on a long winter morning. Then another. The sound grew, wavered, then steadied, an echo of who she'd been and who she was becoming. Somewhere nearby, a child heard her and joined in, their voice off-key but unafraid. Then another. Laughter rose like smoke, climbing through the night, stitching warmth into the shadows. The fire's glow seemed to catch it, to hold it, softening everything around them. But even in that warmth, shadows lingered. That night, as sleep crept in, so did the ghosts. Her body betrayed her before her mind could intervene. Vane's voice slithered through her dreams, slick and poisonous. The acrid stench of oil filled her lungs. Behind her eyelids, glass shattered again and again, a memory too vivid to fade. The nightmares didn't knock. They tore through like storms, leaving her breathless, her hands clamped around the carved bear like it was the only real thing left in the world. And yet, as she sat up, heart pounding and sweat cooling against her skin, she realized something had changed. She was still afraid, but she was no longer alone. The bear in her hand was more than a gift. It was a choice, a reminder. She could rise. She could breathe. She could hum again, even with shaking lips. The past still had teeth, but the future now had a voice. And it was hers. One pale dawn, as the village stirred with the quiet rustle of morning fires and soft footsteps, riders emerged on the ridge like a storm cloud threatening to roll in. Among them sat a soldier clad in faded Union blue, his uniform sun-bleached and fraying, but still heavy with old authority. And beside him, Cornelius Vane. His presence was a wound reopened. He dismounted slowly, eyes narrowed, lips curled into that same calculating smile he'd worn when he offered her safety in exchange for silence. "You're a fugitive," he said, voice low and venomous, like a snake uncoiling. "Signed contracts. Witnesses. You belong to me." The words slithered through the air, meant to shame, to summon fear. But Kasia didn't flinch. Not this time. She stood her ground, her body still but rooted like a tree that had survived one too many storms to bow now. Behind her, the village gathered, not with weapons, but with presence. Silent, solid, and unwavering. Their unity gave weight to her stance. Joran Vale stepped forward, slow and sure, and held out a single medallion, its brass worn but gleaming in the early light. "This belonged to a man who died for peace," he said, his voice carrying like wind over stone. "You forget honor, Cornelius." The name landed with deliberate sharpness, stripping away any illusion of control Vane thought he still held. The silence that followed Vane's declaration didn't shatter. It stretched, long and cutting, drawn so tight it hummed. The air itself seemed to lean in, waiting. And then, slowly, something shifted in Vane's face. The arrogance that had once clung to him like perfume began to falter. His posture stiffened, not with authority, but with unease. He had expected resistance, maybe, but not the still rooted presence of people who would not be moved. His mask cracked, and what slipped through was not victory, but recognition. He wasn't standing in front of victims or subordinates. He was standing before witnesses. He looked not triumphant, but exposed, like a man realizing too late that the world he thought he owned had changed while he wasn't looking. Juniper Cole stepped to Cash's side, her movement quiet, unceremonious. She didn't shield Casha, didn't speak. She simply reached out and took her hand, not as protector, as sister, as echo, as witness. And then, like the slow gathering of a tide, others stepped forward. Elders, mothers, boys who'd once run barefoot through dust. They didn't shout. They didn't raise fists. One by one, they linked hands. A line, a wall, a vow made flesh. There was no violence in it, no threat, only certainty. In that moment, Vane wasn't confronted by rage. He was dwarfed by unity. This was what he could never buy, never force. The strength of people who chose each other freely. He had mistaken fear for respect, control for connection. Now, stripped of both, he looked small. Without a word, he turned. No last insult, no theatrical retreat. Just a man swallowed by the very dust he once commanded, his power scattering behind him like brittle leaves. That night, the fire burned taller than it had in weeks. Not from necessity, but from something unspoken, a shared need to feel warmth, to see light. No one recounted the morning. They didn't need to. What mattered had already been said without speaking. Around the circle, conversation returned in fragments, and then laughter, tentative at first, like a bird testing wind, and then suddenly full, deep, rolling. The kind that fills lungs, the kind that lives in bones. Cassius sat beside Joran Vale, close but not touching, her eyes catching and reflecting the flames. For a long time, she was quiet. Her face held the kind of calm that doesn't come from peace, but from surviving the lack of it. And she spoke softly. Love isn't rescue, is it? Her voice carried no trace of bitterness, only the gravity of someone who had learned too much to romanticize being saved. The firelight danced across her features, and in that light, she looked older, not in years, but in knowing. Joran Vale met her gaze, steady and unflinching. He didn't rush to answer. He let the truth land slow. Then, with a single quiet shake of his head, he said, "It's walking beside someone when they no longer need saving." She didn't nod. She didn't speak again. Instead, she leaned. Not much, just enough for their shoulders to touch, warm through the fabric. It was a gesture so small it could have been missed, but it held everything. She wasn't leaning because she was tired or broken. She wasn't seeking shelter. She was choosing, sitting beside him not as a woman recovering from wreckage, but as someone who had climbed out of it and found solid ground. Not needing to be held up, just wanted to stand beside someone who saw her whole. They tied the red cord around their wrists without spectacle. No vows shouted to the sky. No signatures inked on paper. No audience expecting grandeur. Just root-dyed yarn, spun by hand, its fibers uneven, its color earthy and honest. The thread was rough where it had been handled often, smoothed in places where it had passed through many palms, laced with memory, not ceremony. It wasn't meant to bind like a chain or shine like a ring. It was something quieter, more enduring, a choice made in full light. They stood with bare wrists outstretched, and in the simple knot, they marked not ownership, not possession, but presence. Here, now, together. Elder Mara, the oldest voice among them, lifted her staff with the steadiness of someone who had witnessed the turning of many seasons. Her voice didn't rise, it settled. Each word, spare and deliberate, dropped into the silence like pebbles into a deep well. We wed with truth, with time, with choice. Nothing more was needed. No applause followed, only the low, reverent hum of the village. a resonance that shimmered through the dusk like the echo of wind over water. It wasn't celebration. It was acknowledgement. Kasha danced. Not for them, not for display, but for herself. Her feet found the rhythm of old songs, songs stitched from scraps of memory. Verses about chipped enamel teapots, kitchens stained with time and laughter, chairs that rocked long after their sitters had gone. Juniper Cole, her laughter full of mischief, tugged her into a spinning circle of children, and Kasha let go. Her voice rose with theirs, cracked and breathless, and for the first time in years, it didn't hurt to remember. The memories had softened, worn smooth like river stones. And under this vast, starlit sky, they didn't haunt her, they grounded her. Later, when the fire had faded to embers and the village drifted toward sleep, Kasha leaned close to Joran Vale, the red thread still warm between their wrists. Her voice was low, confessional. I used to dream of escaping. She paused, breath snagging on the truth she hadn't said aloud before. Now I dream of planting things. Her words hung there, delicate, trembling at the edges. Not because she was afraid, but because they were real. She wanted something gentle, something alive. Joran Vale didn't answer right away. He smiled in that slow, deep way he had, like roots settling into the ground. Then let's make a garden, he said, where grief rests and joy rises. He didn't say it like a promise. He said it like a plan already begun. They sat in the hush that followed, not speaking, just breathing in the vision they'd shaped between them. But the night was not still. Something shifted. The wind turned, not wild, but changed. A cooler current licked the edge of the fire's warmth, carrying dust that hadn't been there a moment ago. It gathered low on the horizon, rising like smoke or warning. The prairie seemed to inhale. Beneath their feet, the earth no longer fell asleep, but stirred, restless. Kasha felt the tightness bloom in her chest before her eyes could find the source. A signal, ancient and bodily. She looked out into the dark, into the unformed edge of what was coming. Nothing moved yet, and yet everything did. The red cord on her wrist gave the slightest tug. She touched it, not to anchor herself, but to remember. The garden wasn't safety. Joy was not shelter. But both were worth defending, worth tending, worth choosing again, even as the wind rose. The storm wasn't in the sky that morning. It was in the quiet, thick and deliberate, a kind of hush that settled over the land not with dread, but with reverence. It was the silence of something sacred being honored, not feared. Kasha moved slowly through the garden, her knees pressing into the earth, her fingers burying themselves in the sun-warmed soil. It was still damp from last night's rain, rich and dark, and it clung to her skin with a tenderness that felt almost like recognition. Each handful she turned over seemed to yield not just roots and worms, but echoes of everything she'd carried and begun to release. The garden, with its rough borders and uneven rows, had become her sanctuary. Not just a place to grow food, but a place to grow herself, day by day, inch by inch, from something fractured into something whole. From where she knelt, she could hear the faint, deliberate sound of stones being placed, soft clinks of intention from the river's edge. Joran Vale was there, his body bent in quiet focus, stacking smooth river stones into careful towers. A place for memory, he had said once. A way to let go without forgetting. Each stone, chosen and placed with care, carried a story, a weight, a goodbye. She found herself rising and walking to him, a small stone warming in her palm. It was smooth and dull, but flecked with red, ordinary, yet meaningful. When she reached the pile, she placed it gently among the others, the gesture simple but full. Her voice, when it came, was almost a breath. "Do you forget them?" she asked, not sure if she meant the dead, the pain, or the days that came before this one. Joran Vale didn't lift his head, didn't need to. He placed another stone beside hers, his hand steady. "No," he said, "but I don't carry them all at once." The words settled into her, like seed into furrow, unadorned and true. There was no weight in his voice, only a kind of practiced release. That was the lesson she realized, not in how to hold everything, but in learning what could be set down and when. Strength wasn't about bearing the unbearable forever. It was about knowing when to let the earth hold it for you. That night, under a sky scrubbed clean by wind, they lay beside each other wrapped in blankets woven with stories. There was no fire between them that demanded to consume, no need to burn through the dark. Their hands found each other with quiet certainty, fingers laced not in urgency, but in peace. They shared the space the way people do who have nothing to prove and nothing to claim, only the long, steady work of choosing. This was not a love of rescue or conquest. It was a love built the way roots hold soil, firm, unseen, necessary. Somewhere far away, perhaps in a leather chair beside a crackling hearth, Vane might be telling his version of what happened. He would speak of Kasha as if she were a possession misplaced, a chapter gone awry in his tale of control, a woman he almost owned, a future he almost wrote. But his voice would not carry far, because stories like hers did not live in places like that. They were not passed around in parlors or pinned to histories written by men who mistook taking for triumph. Her story would live in the hush before dawn, in the wind that moved through tall grass, in the embers of shared firelight. It would be sung perhaps not loudly, but surely by those who had endured, not because they were remembered by others, but because they remembered themselves, not as a conquest survived, but as a life reclaimed.